big thanks to GFMD and to Deutsche Welle for organizing this lab. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the background to this session and a little bit more about the UN high-level panel report, and then some of the challenges and the opportunities that exist to really start to look more seriously at integrating media, freedom of the media, access to information into the post-MDG framework. I should say that I'm talking on behalf of BBC Media Action. That's the BBC's international development charity. I don't speak here on behalf of the BBC itself. So in May this year, the report of a high-level panel of eminent persons, co-chaired by Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, President Yudhoyono of Indonesia, and David Cameron of the UK, set out its new recommendations for a new development agenda, and many of you will know this, entitled a new global partnership. And as many of you will also know, it proposed an indicative set of 12 new universal goals, the first of which was to end extreme poverty. But among one of the 11 other goals, alongside those focused on health, empowerment of girls and women, improving food security and so on, is one designed to ensure good governance and effective institutions. And within that goal, 5 elements were identified as necessary for achieving that goal. One of these is to ensure people enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of association, peaceful protests, and access to independent media and information. And another of those elements was to guarantee the public's right to information and access to government data. The report for many, including myself, also seemed to mark a bit of a shift, a slight shift at least, away from a development approach that over recent years has been really quite heavily focused on building up the capacity of a state, to one which was more invested in building up the capacity of society. And so it says, for example, that the global partnership, that people must be central to a new global partnership. To do this, they need the freedom to voice their views and participation in the decisions that affect their lives without fear. They need access to information and to independent media. Such a partnership should, the report argues, be a principal priority for future development action. Now that's arguably not very new. The original Millennium Declaration in 2000, which articulated the original Millennium Development Goals, also had a lot of quite similar language, and also affirmed freedom of expression and association as one of the fundamental values underpinning the MDGs. And it urged a commitment to ensure the freedom of media to perform their essential role and right of the public to have access to information. That was in the original Millennium Declaration. But that language never got into the goals. And it's the goals that everyone focuses on, and it is the goals that have shaped development priorities and development agendas. And so we are now at a different time. We have a different opportunity. There is a different state of affairs where there is an explicit recommendation that issues of freedom of the media and access to independent information should be within the actual post-2015 goals themselves. So that's just the UN high-level panel report. There are, as many of you also know, thousands of discussions happening all over the world about what should be in a post-MDG framework. And there is now a kind of sausage machine of discussions and diplomacy and debate and argument over what actually does replace the post-MDG framework. And around here and many other similar meetings, there are literally hundreds of thousands of discussions around that. So that's sort of the background to the opportunity. And let me just say why I'm actually quite pessimistic about whether this is actually going to survive the sausage machine going into the next phase as the actual goals themselves are decided. Well, the first is history. We do seem to be moving over recent years towards a development system that is founded on consensus. And some of you will know the 4th High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness in Busan a couple of years ago was focused on mapping out a new consensus on development cooperation for development effectiveness, for aid effectiveness. And there was a bit of an argument at that meeting and indeed run up to it about whether media should be integrated into that consensus. And actually the word media was ultimately left out of a fourth high-level forum statement, arguably, and many people argue this, to satisfy the wishes or the desires of China and others who may be quite less supportive of a commitment to freedom of expression. So Busan, albeit at a much lower level in a much more specific area of development arena, did sort of point the way that if you're going to have a consensus on development in the 21st century, it's quite difficult to put issues of freedom of the media within that consensus. So that's one reason I'm quite pessimistic. The other reason I'm pessimistic is there's, and I hope this meeting can help to address this, there doesn't seem to be a terrifically connected or determined effort to secure this recommendation actually be it surviving the sausage-making process that goes into the post-MDG agenda. What one might expect to happen is a kind of unified getting together of media development organizations, media freedom organizations, access to information organizations, data transparency organizations, and many others who have a central interest in how people access information, what they do with it, how governments publish it, and so on, and actually start working together to try and secure a clear common framework, an agenda and position, and an effort to actually support this. And it's not totally clear to me, and I stand to be corrected by people in the room, that determined, connected effort across multiple stakeholders and multiple groups is actually happening. And in order for that to happen, we're quite late in the day for that to happen. And certainly media freedom organizations, media development organizations, and all those other groups have got a lot to gain, I think, by really trying to pursue this in a much more determined way. I think also is that it's difficult to see where the diplomatic champions of this particular agenda are emanating from. And it's also, that's going to be quite a complex, difficult process. Do we actually have to have a big argument with those who are less comfortable or keen on putting issues of media freedom at the heart of this agenda? After all, it is Article 19 is already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We can build on existing rights frameworks for this to go forward. But what it could easily turn into is a kind of, yet again, the West saying that these are the issues that we care about, this is the issues that we want, and it's a Western agenda which is equated to issues of freedom of the media being part of a development agenda. I don't think that's necessary. I think what we actually ought to be building on is a set of developing country declarations, most iconically the Windhoek Declaration, that this is not a Western agenda supporting freedom of the media. It is a universal agenda where people all over the world have repeatedly and consistently for 50 years said this is part of what they want in terms of development. So that's one part of that kind of positioning. And the other part, though, is that yes, we are at the EU development days. This is Europe. And a bit of me feels that is the future development agenda becoming literally devalued, devoid of value? Are we moving towards a kind of quite technocratic, depoliticized set of targets around which we can all sort of agree, but which are devoid of the fundamental values that those who support development in different places actually hold dear? And I think this is quite a challenge, this issue of freedom of the media, which often is the first to get sacrificed when you're talking about a consensus around development. It does tell us about, it does tell us something about where the whole development agenda is moving towards. In terms of, is it an agenda informed by a set of values, or is it something which is an essentially technocratic one? In the last couple of minutes, on the last minute on this, so why do I think this is actually fundamental? Well, one reason is that the historic reason. One set of reasons around this issue being fundamental is about human dignity, and it is enshrined in Article 19, and we should hang on to that and build on that. The other is about development effectiveness, and we hear a lot more arguments from other panelists and others in the room of how a free media makes government more accountable to its citizens, more responsive, makes it perform better. And Jeanette in particular, I know, is going to talk about that. The third is we are living in a ubiquitously connected age. And in 2000, when the original Millennium Development Goals were formulated, we did not have that ubiquitous connection. Increasingly, how people use information, how they exploit it, how they manipulate it, is how development happens. It's how societies change. It's how people take control of their lives. And the idea of a development agenda moving forward into the next decade and the next decade after that, which somehow ignores the fundamental role of how people access and use and communicate information, seems utterly removed from the reality of how change is happening, development takes place, people are seizing control of their economic, political, and social destinies. And I don't think a post-2015 agenda which doesn't take this issue into account is seriously going to be credible. And the final issue is that there is real harm to be done without support to the media. Media is being increasingly co-opted and exploited by factional forces, sometimes governments, but often extreme political, religious, ethnic and other forms of society. The whole political constructs and structures of society are changing very substantially according to how people are accessing information and often how their opinion is being manipulated and the extent to which they have their own platforms for voice and discussion. If we ignore this issue at our peril, there's a long way to go before we actually translate this into a serious part of a development agenda. There are very few people within the development system who are focused in engaging on this, understanding on it, and devising more effective strategies to support it. Unless something happens on this, the development system, I think, could become less and less relevant.